Today we tell the story of a man who was born in southern Appalachia, but whose life took him a long way from home. All the way to Brazil, in fact. And how and why he went there is another one of the stories of Appalachia.
Wonder why somebody goes to Brazil like this. Vacation? Corned beef? Sort of like the tropics in a way.
Well, yeah, it's nice and warm down there. That's true.
Well, I'm kind of lost on this. I know that who we're getting ready to talk about, but yeah, I'm making light of it a little bit. This man left America and went to Brazil, and it was all because of a reason that we're getting ready to tell you in this story from Appalachia. And this is a very interesting story, to say the least.
Oh, it is. And our subject today is a man named Ezekiel B. Pyles. Well, Mr. Pyles happened to be a Confederate cavalryman, a survivor of some of the most daring raids of the Civil War, and eventually one of those Southerners who packed up and left the United States altogether after the war was over. Now, when we say left, we're not talking about going to Canada or Mexico. No, sir. We're talking about South America. You see, Ezekiel was part of a wave of ex-Confederates who decided to start over in what was then the Brazilian Empire and never came back.
So this is sort of like, Steve, thinking about this, sort of like our celebrities and things like that who decide they don't want to be here anymore, so they want to live a better life overseas in Europe, correct?
Well, sort of like that, I guess. Yeah, you can put it that way.
Okay, well, let's start this story at the beginning, in the hills of North Georgia. Ezekiel Pyles was born October 1st, 1847, to Samuel and Nancy Pyles. His dad was a minister, and they were your typical mountain family, hard-working, close-knit, and living off the land. But by the time the Civil War broke out, young Ezekiel was still a teenager. But like a lot of boys his age, he wasn't sitting on the sidelines. In September of 1862, he enlisted in a cavalry unit, the unit commanded by Brigadier General John Hunt Morgan. You've probably heard that name somewhere. And if that name does ring a bell, it's probably because of, you guessed it, Morgan's raid, that wild ride into Indiana and Ohio in the summer of 1863. Ezekiel Pyles was one of Morgan's raiders.
Well, by June and July of 1863, the Civil War was raging across the South. That was the summer of the battles of Gettysburg and Vicksburg. And while all that was going on, General Morgan was leading about 2,000 Confederate cavalrymen, including young Ezekiel Pyles, on a 46-day, 1,000-mile raid through Kentucky, Indiana, and up into Ohio. That raid caused panic all across the Midwest. Civilians fled, militias scrambled, and Union generals had to divert troops from other campaigns just to chase Morgan down. It was classic hit-and-run warfare. Fast horses, quick strikes, and plenty of chaos. But eventually, Morgan's luck ran out. His command was cornered in northeastern Ohio and forced to surrender. Morgan himself got sent to a Union prison up in Columbus. But being the showman he was, Rod, he actually escaped by tunneling out.
Well, must have been a very smart man to be able to figure it out and get out of that place. Well, Ezekiel Pyles, on the other hand, he managed to escape before the surrender even happened. During the Battle of Buffington Island, the largest Civil War battle fought in Ohio, he slipped across the Ohio River and, with a few others, made it into what's now West Virginia. And from there, Pyles made his way back south, eventually joining up with another cavalry unit, Company D of Dorch's 2nd Battalion, Kentucky Cavalry, and by August of 1864, he was fighting again. This time, he was in East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia.
Now, one of those battles was Saltville, fought on October 2nd, 1864. That one's remembered for being especially brutal, as we told you about in our podcast episode about the Battle of Saltville. Ezekiel Pyles was there, and he was right in the thick of it. A few months later came the Battle of Kingsport, December 13th, 1864. Kingsport, as most of our listeners know, sits along the Holston River in East Tennessee, and it was part of General George Stoneman's raid, the same campaign that swept up through East Tennessee and into southwest Virginia. Pyles and 300 other Confederate defenders were set up on the east bank of the North Fork of the Holston, trying to hold off Stoneman's Union troops who were camped across the river on the grounds of the Rotherwood Mansion. But the commanders of those Union forces pulled a classic flanking move by sending some of their men north to ford the river and attack from behind.
Well, the result? It was a rout. Many Confederates were killed or captured, and Ezekiel Pyles was one of those who was taken prisoner. Pyles was shipped off to Camp Chase in Ohio, one of the big Union prison camps. He stayed there until February of 1865, when he was exchanged for a Union prisoner and sent to Point Lookout, Maryland. Now, not long after that, he wound up in a Confederate hospital in Richmond, probably worn out, half-starved, probably barely with clothes on his back, and like so many soldiers by that point, he was released in March and tried to make his way back to his unit in southwest Virginia.
But by April, the war was all but over. Lee surrendered at Appomattox on April 12, 1865, and for most men, well, that was the end. But not for Ezekiel Pyles. He couldn't bring himself to accept defeat. Instead, he headed to central Virginia, where the last remnants of the Confederate government, Jefferson Davis and his cabinet, were trying to regroup in Danville. From there, Pyles became part of Davis's final military escort as they fled farther south, through North Carolina, and then on into Georgia. It all came to an end in Irwin County, Georgia on May 9, 1865, when Union troops captured Jefferson Davis.
And for Pyles, that was it. The next day, he surrendered too. His war was finally over. Now, after the war, you'd think that Ezekiel Pyles might have gone back home to North Georgia or maybe settled down somewhere in Tennessee to move on with his life, but he didn't do that. Pyles was a true believer in the Confederate cause, and as such, he just couldn't stomach living under Yankee rule. Not only that, but the South, it was in ruins. Towns and cities burned, farms left barren, railroads twisted, the economy gone. Men like Pyles had lost everything and more than just a few like him that still believed the cause hadn't really died, and it just kind of shifted somewhere else.
And somewhere else turned out to be Brazil. That fall, in November 1865, the state of South Carolina formed a colonization society. Now, representatives were sent to Brazil to see if it would be an appropriate choice to establish a colony of disaffected Confederates. Those sent gave a glowing report on the country, noting that slaves were cheap. James Gaston from South Carolina made his own travels to Brazil. When he returned to the United States, he published a book, Hunting a Home in Brazil, in 1867, promoting the idea of resettlement in the South American country. On the heels of this report, Colonel William Hutchinson Norris of Alabama traveled to Brazil and, along with his son Robert, bought land along the banks of the Colombo River that belonged to the town of Santa Barbara do Oeste. There he set up a colony for those whose farms and lives had been destroyed by the Civil War and were seeking a new life away from the defeated Confederate States of America.
Well, word started spreading through the South that Emperor Dom Pedro II of Brazil was inviting people to emigrate. Brazil wanted skilled farmers and builders, people who could grow cotton, sugarcane, and bring some new ideas. And unlike the United States after the war, slavery was still legal there. Well, that was a big draw for some Southerners. They figured they could rebuild their world just as it had been before Appomattox. Same crops, same customs, same social order. So ships started leaving from New Orleans and Galveston, packed with Southern families carrying what little they had left, which consisted of tools, seeds, Bibles, and what valuables, like family silver, that they still possessed. Around 20,000 Southerners in all made that journey over the next few decades. Ezekiel Pyles was one of them. He and his family sailed to Brazil in 1867 and ended up on that land bought by Senator Norris on what came to be later known as Americana, about 60 miles northwest of Sao Paulo. It started as a colony of ex-Confederates, farmers, teachers, soldiers, and yes, a few preachers too.
Those preachers ministered to their Protestant flock there in predominantly Catholic Brazil. Now, there was a prohibition against burying non-Catholics in the cemeteries of cities administered by the Catholic Church. So the new Southern immigrants began burying their dead in a spot there in Americana. This cemetery became known as the Campo Cemetery, where the new settlers and their deceased Brazilian descendants are buried. Now, life in Brazil wasn't easy. The climate was hot, the soil different, and most folks that moved to Americana didn't speak a word of Portuguese. But the Brazilian government welcomed them with open arms. That government gave them land, temporary housing in what they called, in English, the immigrant hotel, and even gave them food and drink to get started.
Well, when they got there, those Southern immigrants went right to work. They planted cotton, sugarcane, and started little communities that looked a lot like home. White clapboard churches, front porch houses, and Sunday dinners straight out of Georgia or Alabama. Speaking of churches, in 1895, the first Presbyterian church in the country was established. Now, some bought slaves there in Brazil, while others hired freedmen from the states to come work the land as sharecroppers. It was a strange mix of the old South and sort of like a new world, the antebellum South under the hot Brazilian sun. But with time, it became obvious to the people who'd moved to Brazil that things would have to change as that little Confederate enclave started to blend in with their neighbors. The settlers' children learned Portuguese, married Brazilians, and began calling themselves Confederados.
Well, their farms prospered, especially when the region became a sugarcane center. And while the first generation held on tight to Southern ways, flying Confederate flags and speaking English at church, the later generations over time became thoroughly Brazilian. Today, Americana is a modern Brazilian city, but its Southern roots are still there if you know where to look. And that cemetery we talked about, the Campo Cemetery, Ezekiel Pyles himself was laid to rest there when he passed away in December 1916 at the age of 69. And every year, locals still hold a Festa dos Confederados, or Confederate Festival. Families come together dressed in hoop skirts and gray uniforms, waving Confederate flags, eating fried chicken, and celebrating their Southern roots under a Brazilian sky.
And somewhere among those descendants, people who speak Portuguese and call themselves Brazilians are the bloodlines of Ezekiel B. Pyles, that boy from the Appalachian hills of North Georgia. Wow, what a story, Steve.
There are still a few people, I believe, that speak English down in Americana.
Wow.
And if you go on YouTube, you'll find a bunch of channels of people that have gone down there. In fact, there's this one that I follow. It's a young fella from New York City, goes by the name Shauma NYC, who is a language savant. Mm-hmm. He knows dozens of languages and could pick up another one, just by listening to it. He went down there and he found a fella that spoke English, and this guy sounded almost like he was from somewhere in Mississippi or Alabama, but with a strange little Latin kind of lilt to the language. It was odd, but you could certainly understand him.
Well, and this is certainly like the things that we've heard about. When settlers came here, they found people in the mountains. Some were speaking in what they referred to as broken Elizabethan English, things of that nature. And then you had a lot of those people that moved west. A lot of people from this region moved and left and went to Texas, places like that, because they say that, Appalachia, Texas, they say that there is a unique sound about Texans because they sound so much like they're from Appalachia. And so, yeah, it's almost like there's been I don't want to use it in such a bad way, but contamination, so to speak, of all these southern accents and everything that were brought south down to Brazil.
Yeah, well, you can't go to a place, and a lot of people that came to the U.S. can verify this. You can't go to a place that has a dominant language and expect to continue speaking the language you spoke where you used to live for generation after generation. Eventually, you forget that language and you just speak what everybody else speaks. In this case, it was Portuguese or Brazilian Portuguese in Americana.
Yeah, and you know what else funny about this? We have been calling them Portuguese. In Appalachia, there was reference to Portuguese, but they called them Portuguese.
Uh-huh.
So, there's a little change right there. But, they knew who Portuguese were. They knew of the country and knew of some of the people that had come there. But, yeah, this is just unbelievable that, they were able to go and almost set up almost like a new colony there in Brazil and, carry some of these things from the South, the old South, down to South America.
Yeah. And for listeners who don't know what you were referring to, you were talking about the Melungeons.
Right.
When we talk about the Portuguese. Yeah, this is a great story. This is one that we actually told many, many years ago when we first started. And we dug up a little bit more details on what happened down in Brazil and decided to retell this story for you. We hope you liked it. Well, folks, that's the story of Ezekiel Pyles, one of the last holdouts of the Civil War, the Confederados. Another one of the stories of Appalachia. Thanks for listening. If you like our stories, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast app or go over to our YouTube channel. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.